Chapter 5 The Tavern Girl. The tavern was loud and boisterous, with the sounds of many men and women filling up the small room, who were all talking and laughing at the same time. It was one of the many such taverns that villages around the great forest boasted, with several tables and booths spread out in the large room that were lit by homemade forest game candles. Sitting alone in one corner was a young man of perhaps 20 years of age who was eating a meal and reading a large leather-bound tome. A diamond-shaped birthmark could be seen underneath the young man's left eye, which he unconsciously reached up to scratch at every few minutes. One of the tavern girls named Mandy stood in a corner with several other girls and was visiting with her friend. "What about that one?" she asked her friend Leisha as she discreetly gestured toward the young man with the diamond-shaped tattoo.
"Ooh, he is so cute and brawny. I bet he's quiet when he finishes," said her friend, and they both laughed gamely with each other in the loud room. "First one to land him buys the other dinner," she offered, and Leisha smiled in her knowing way. The two girls quickly turned toward each other and flashed their fingers in a routine way until Leisha triumphantly said, "Ha!" She had won the small finger game they played, marking her as the winner, who would get the first shot at the mark. Mandy frowned as her friend ran her hands through her hair, making it land in a becoming way upon her shoulders. She knew she might immediately lose the bet if Leisha were able to get the young man to take her upstairs before she even had her chance to try. Leisha was a stunning brunette with a slim waist and ample bosom, and Mandy watched as her friend sauntered over to the young man who sat in the corner alone. As she watched from across the room, Mandy wondered what she could offer the young man if her beautiful friend failed in her advances. She herself was a natural redhead without an ample bosom, and knew that most men did not savor her shape in comparison to that of her friend. Still, she was able to hold her own in that department, and was always sought after by the many travelers that came through the forest village. Just then, she saw Leisha lean over and speak to the young man with her cleavage pressed right into his line of sight. Mandy could not hear what was said, but suddenly Leisha stood straight up with a disdainful look upon her face. She raised up her hand and brought it in a slapping motion toward the man's face, but he quickly blocked her attack and gave her a shove backwards. Leisha stumbled back but recovered and shouted, "Have it your way then!" then huffed back toward Mandy. Her friend returned and her cheeks were red as her anger overcame her. The young man watched her walk away, then returned to his meal and reading as the hubbub of the tavern continued around them. "You can have the bastard," Leisha said as she huffed away to ply her wares on another customer. Mandy turned her face away and hid a smile. She did not like to see her friend in such a state, but always thought it was the funniest seeing Leisha lose her temper. Mandy took a moment to artfully run her hands through her favorite attribute and shaped her mane of hair in an attractive frame around her face. She sauntered over toward the young man, making sure to measure her strides so that her hips swayed in an appealing way as she walked. The young man had not looked up from his reading and had just finished scratching at the birthmark underneath his eye when she arrived at his table. Deepening her voice, she said in a loud, husky way, "Hey there, fine traveler. Would you enjoy the company of a lady this evening?" The young man looked up at her, and Mandy's voice caught in her throat. There was a violent energy coming from the traveler, something she could not define that put her off, and she stammered as he looked at her. "What I mean to say, that is, she said lamely. Just then, he grinned at her, and the movement changed the countenance of his face into an appealing welcome. She relaxed and smiled back at him. The young traveler stood up and grabbed a well-worn travel pack which he stuffed the large tome into. A metallic staff weapon was tied to the pack, which he swung over one shoulder before taking her hand in his. She grinned at him and led him toward the flight of stairs at the entrance to the tavern. His hand was warm and powerful within hers, and she felt her loins tighten in pleasure as she anticipated the upcoming encounter. Mandy stroked the young man's sleeping face gently. His lovemaking had been intense and enjoyable, and she had climaxed twice without having to feign her passion. He had finally finished with a loud cry and had collapsed down into her embrace and had fallen into a fitful sleep. Mandy had looked into his face as he had climaxed and had momentarily seen an unexpected gentleness in his eyes just before he had collapsed upon her. She was used to the men falling asleep, but was not usually drawn to stroking them afterwards. Nevertheless, she could not stop herself from touching the young man's handsome face, which was made gentle in his sleep. Just then, she noticed the diamond shape under his eye and touched the shape with her finger. The young man sprang awake and forcefully grabbed her by the wrist.
The strange energy she had felt from before had returned as she looked at the fierce expression on his face.
Hey, it's just me, she said, and he immediately released her.
I'm sorry, I have trouble sleeping, he said in a strong voice.
It's okay, she said, and she gently rubbed at the spot where he had grabbed her.
After a moment of awkward silence, she stood up from the bed and began dressing. The young man seemed to want to say something, but instead reached into his travel pack and pulled out a small purse. He selected several silver-colored coins from within, which he placed on the corner of the bed. Mandy took the silver, then quickly exited the room. Jacen walked away from the village tavern with his travel hood pulled up to cover his head. Rain poured down from above, and he quickly moved into the forest where he knew the branches would provide a mild cover from the wetness. Finally, the village was left behind him, and he moved along one of the many paths that led through the great forest. He became lost in his thoughts and replayed the events with the tavern girl earlier. The young man had become awakened by the feeling of being touched on his face and had been startled into a reflexive defensive posture. Once he had realized where he was, he had immediately released the girl's wrist and tried to hide his shame. As she had hastily left the room, he cursed himself for not being able to savor the feeling of her touch. Quickly dressing, he had left the small room and headed out into the night. The rain let up and turned into a drizzle. The moon was full, but Jacen had sated his dark urge with the girl and no longer felt swayed by its unusual power over him. The night was dark and uncommonly quiet, and he noticed the usual forest sounds were missing as the rain had caused the wildlife to seek shelter. Jacen looked around himself as he walked in the uncommon quiet. In the periphery of his vision, he could just make out the shape of something hiding in the wet trees that disappeared whenever he looked directly at it. The whisperings began then, and a great thunder of whispering voices began talking in his mind all at once.
We, trollop and prancing, came one whisper.
Yorendia scutanda milio cantante, spoke another in a rapid arcane language. Jacen stumbled to a stop and grabbed his head as the many voices flooded into his mind. Stumbling forward, he looked to the right of the path and saw a darkness forming within the trees. It was like looking into the great wide maw of some gigantic creature of the night. The whispers bid him to enter the cone of darkness.
Come in and play with us,
one whisper within the darkness said in a deep parody of a voice.
Hello,
came another. Jacen began to breathe hard as all he could hear were the voices all around him within his mind. It was a cacophony of sound, and he looked up at the sky and saw the full moon above him. Suddenly his eyes shone with an inner light, and he looked back upon the trees around him. Everywhere he looked were the dark glowing red outlines of hideous creatures. He could now hear their voices clearly, all talking at once, each trying to be heard over the others. It was a roar of sound, and Jacen quickly became overwhelmed and fell to the ground with his hands covering his ears. Just as he was about to pass out, he saw the outline of a gorgeous glowing red body step into his field of view. Jacen awoke some time later and found himself lying on the ground near the edge of the path. A screen of clouds had covered the moon, and he picked himself up and gathered his spilled travel pack from the ground. He looked around but could no longer hear the whispers or see the glowing red creatures. The forest had resumed its normal nighttime sounds of wildlife. He pressed onward following the path, and after walking several miles, he heard several loud call-outs coming from the trees on each side of him. Jacen's senses flared out and he jumped behind a screen of brush just as a large group of forest brigands moved into view. The group of brigands wore a mismatched selection of clothing that caused them to blend in with the forest. They all carried daggers and spears, and several of them carried torches that were used to guide the large group through the dense trees. From his vantage point, Jacen counted 20 men and knew he probably would not be able to defend himself if attacked by that many. He heard several of the men talking to themselves as they passed by.
"Got me a piece of that back at the tavern,"
said one man as he walked alongside his companion. "Maybe join a mercantile after this next job," came another. After a time, the group had pressed on, and Jacen moved out from his hiding spot after he was sure he was alone. He looked farther up the path and could just make out the outline of torches as the group of brigands moved into the trees where their torches were soon no longer visible. Moving with extra caution, Jacen quickly moved past the section of the forest where the large group of men had exited and trotted quickly onward. Just then, a coach being pulled by a train of horses came cantering up the path in his direction. There were 2 armed men on horseback who were leading the coach, and one of them galloped up to Jacen and held out a spear in his direction. "Stop there, traveler!" shouted the man as he aimed his spear at Jacen. Jacen stopped his walk and held his hands out. "I have no trouble," Jacen said. The man on horseback looked Jacen up and down, saw that he carried no weapon, then nodded and withdrew his spear. His companion called out to him from where the coach was passing, and the man turned to shout out a response. Suddenly, the air was filled with smoking projectiles that landed upon the ground and exploded into a dense screen of smoke. The man's mount reared up in fright, and it cried out and began bucking up and down. The man lost hold of his spear as he fought against the animal's erratic movements. Jacen covered his mouth with the hem of his tunic as his eyes began watering from the smoke-filled atmosphere. He could barely see, but heard many men running into the area to attack the 2 men on horseback. Moving quickly, he jumped into the nearby tree line and watched as the 2 men were each pulled from their mounts by several dark figures and pummeled to the ground. As the smoke began to clear, the forest brigands cheered as they finished the attack, and several of the rough-looking men had moved over to the unguarded coach. The sounds of pillaging broke out, and one of the brigands shouted, "Oi! Look at what we have here, then!" Jacen watched from his hiding spot as the man who had called out stood back from the coach. 2 well-dressed women and an older man were huddling together inside the craft. The brigand who had called out to his fellows pushed into the interior of the vehicle and pulled out the older man and pushed him roughly onto the ground. The old man sat up and froze as another brigand held a wickedly sharp spear to his chest. The 2 women were pulled from the craft with a small scream, and Jacen could see it was a matron with a younger woman slightly older than himself. The 2 women were finely dressed, and the 2 brigands that had roughly pulled them out from the craft suddenly tore open their blouses. Jacen's blood rushed at the sight of the women's breasts, and he could not help but continue to watch the building confrontation. Just then, a loud galloping noise was heard, and a platoon of 12 men on rafterback rode their strange mounts directly into the throng of milling brigands. They wore matching armor and carried finely honed short swords and spears. The armor of the militia was emblazoned on the chest with the symbol of a red dragon, the mark of the Dark Lord's blocked warriors. With interest, Jacen noticed the forest brigands had fallen back away from the oncoming group with tension and fear in their bodies. The lead rider came to a stop and slid off his mount. He handed the lead rope to one of his men and roughly pushed his way through the brigands over to where the women were and stopped in front of them. Jacen watched as the armored man looked at their torn blouses. The 2 women were whimpering and holding on to each other. The man reached over to his side and pulled out a short sword from the scabbard at his side. "Get back into your coach now," he ordered the 2 women in a deep and gravelly voice. The women listened to him and stepped back into the coach. The armored man used the tip of his sword to close the cabin door of the vehicle just as the older man who had been pushed to the ground stood up and approached him. "My good man, thank you for," he began, but the leader suddenly spun and rammed his short sword through the older man's stomach. The older man cried out and grabbed at the weapon within him before sliding off it to fall upon the ground, where he writhed in pain. Jacen could see a large spreading pool of red staining the older man's shirt. After a moment, he stopped moving, and his blood began to pour out onto the ground. The forest brigands tensed as the armored man killed the older, and they all gripped their weapons more tightly. The armored leader held up his short sword and pointed its bloody tip at the throng of brigands. "Kill them all!" he shouted, and his men began running their mounts into the group and hacking and slashing at the brigands around them. The strange creatures they rode upon made screeching noises in the ensuing battle. The brigands began defending themselves, and Jacen watched the battle from his hiding spot. The fight did not last long, as the weapons of the forest thieves could not penetrate the armor of the mounted armored men, and to the contrary, the armored men's weapons cut large and wicked cuts into the fighting brigands. Soon, only a few brigands who had not been cut down retreated and ran off into the forest away from the grisly scene of carnage. As the short and brutal fight came to an end, Jacen quietly began backing up as he watched the armored men begin searching the dead bodies for spoils. The leader was busy wiping his blade off on the tunic of one of the fallen brigands, and as he slid his weapon back into its scabbard, he walked over to the coach and opened the door he had just recently closed. The last thing Jacen could hear before he turned and fled deeper into the forest was the sound of one of the women screaming, a sound that soon quieted behind his running form. The cowled man watched the grisly scene play out from the screen of brush that hid his form from view. A momentary glow could be seen from the direction of his face as he moved off to follow the dangerous young man who had run away from the armored men.